Ron Howard had always carried a reputation that set him apart from the stormy, unpredictable world that shaped him. In public and in private, he was the steady presence, the quiet center in an industry built on spectacle and noise. His colleagues often described him as a man of restraint, dignity, and unwavering courtesy, a filmmaker whose calm nature could soften any conflict. Yet, on one rare occasion, when he was asked about the darker truths of the Hollywood that raised him, something shifted in his expression. His voice lowered, his eyes hardened, and the warmth that usually accompanied his words disappeared. He said, with a quiet certainty, "You would not believe what those legends did when the camera stopped." It was the kind of statement that dissolved nostalgia in an instant. The golden age of Hollywood, long remembered as a glittering era of elegance and artistic triumph, suddenly revealed its fractured core. Beneath the glow of studio lights and the shimmering facade of movie stardom, Ron Howard saw something far less romantic. He saw a world built on silence, cruelty, and exploitation. He saw a generation of stars elevated to mythic status while their shadows grew unnoticed, allowed to deepen, protected by a machine that valued profit over truth. This contradiction is where the real story begins. For decades, audiences worshiped the icons who shaped American cinema, unaware of the hidden lives they led and the lives they altered. Their charm, their charisma, and their fame became armor, shielding them from consequences and accountability. These actors were celebrated as cultural giants, yet behind closed doors they revealed impulses far darker than the characters they portrayed. What Ron Howard eventually discovered was not a single secret or isolated scandal, but a pattern that stretched across generations. A pattern where power overshadowed morality, where a smile could hide cruelty, and where silence became the currency of survival. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms are really driving this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial mistakes to the irreversible damage, to see how the entertainment world works and how an icon is redefined. The deeper Howard ventured into the stories of Hollywood's past, the more he realized that the myths surrounding its legends had been crafted with meticulous care. Every newspaper article, every magazine cover, and every studio-approved biography was part of an illusion designed to elevate the star and erase the scars. As a filmmaker committed to understanding truth, Howard felt compelled to confront what had been hidden. Not to condemn, but to understand how an era built on artistic brilliance could also carry such profound moral decay. This journey leads us to six figures whose names once defined cinema itself. Six icons whose influence shaped generations, yet whose private lives tell a story very different from the one immortalized on screen. Their rise, their power, and ultimately their downfall reveal the truth Ron Howard learned the hard way: the golden age of Hollywood was never golden at all. It was a world of contradictions where the brightest lights cast the darkest shadows. The deeper Ron Howard delved into the origins of Hollywood's golden age, the more he realized that the glamour was only a thin veil stretched over a system meticulously designed to protect power. To understand why so many legends were able to rise unchecked, one must first understand the structure that carried them. Hollywood of the early 20th century was not merely an entertainment industry. It was a self-contained empire where the studio system controlled everything: casting, publicity, public perception, and, most importantly, the fate of the individuals who lived within it. For a young filmmaker like Howard, who had grown up on sets filled with discipline and respect, the stories of the past felt almost unbelievable. The studio heads of the 1930s through the 1960s were not creative collaborators. They were monarchs with complete authority. With a single phone call, they could erase a scandal, silence a witness, or manufacture a completely new identity for a star. Their power reached into police stations, editorial offices, and courtrooms. Every narrative, both on-screen and off, flowed through them. This was the soil in which Hollywood's darkest legends took root. The structure bred arrogance. When actors became profoundly aware that their fame was protected by executives and reinforced by publicity machines, they understood that consequences were optional. Public saw them as flawless heroes, risk-takers, adventurers, or symbols of moral strength. Behind the curtain, however, the absence of accountability created the perfect environment for destructive impulses. Ron Howard described this system as a pressure chamber, one where external perfection was demanded, but internal chaos was tolerated, if not quietly encouraged. The roots of the problem became painfully clear when Howard studied the early life and career of Errol Flynn. Flynn's rise to stardom was meteoric. With the success of Captain Blood in 1935, Warner Brothers recognized his potential and built an empire around his image. But the studio also built something else, a shield. In private, Flynn was consumed by a sense of invincibility. His flamboyance, charm, and recklessness collided with a deeper belief that he was untouchable. Studio executives believed that maintaining his image was more valuable than confronting the truth. When he faced accusations from two teenage girls in 1942, the lie of invulnerability was exposed. Not because the accusations surprised anyone in Hollywood, but because they threatened the very machinery that had elevated him. Howard once said that reading about Flynn's trial felt like discovering the blueprint of Hollywood's moral decay. The arrogance was not an accident. It was a product of a system that rewarded charisma and punished vulnerability. Studio lawyers worked tirelessly behind the scenes. Witnesses disappeared. Publicists wrote narratives that turned Flynn into a misunderstood rogue instead of a man facing severe allegations. Even after the acquittal, the internal pattern was impossible to ignore. The message was simple and devastating. Fame could rewrite reality. The same sense of systemic indulgence surfaced in the story of Kirk Douglas. Young filmmakers admired Douglas for his intensity and emotional depth, but those who worked alongside him saw something strikingly different. Howard described it as a rage under the smile, a force that never truly rested. That rage, however, did not come from nowhere. Douglas had risen from poverty through relentless ambition. The studio system rewarded that ambition, but it also fueled the illusion that he had the right to dominate every space he entered. On sets, his temper was legendary, and whispers about his behavior toward women were circulated quietly but persistently. When allegations resurfaced decades later regarding Natalie Wood, who was only 16 at the time of the alleged assault, Howard found himself grappling with the deeper structure that allowed such stories to disappear. These events did not exist in isolation. They existed in a world where criticism of a star was treated as disloyalty and where silence was the most valuable currency. Even respected directors struggled to rein him in. Stanley Kubrick, who collaborated with Douglas twice, described him as both inspiring and impossible to control. Such paradoxes flourished only in an environment where power had no counterbalance. The roots of this culture extended into personalities who expressed their dominance not through physical aggression, but through emotional cruelty. Fay Dunaway, whose performances were mesmerizing and unforgettable, wielded control in ways that created fear across film sets. To Howard, Dunaway represented the cold psychological dimension of Hollywood's toxic structure. Her talent was undeniable, yet the industry around her had given her such unchecked authority that compassion became optional. Assistants, makeup artists, and even directors became targets of her sharp demands. Her pursuit of perfection, once admirable, became a mechanism of destruction when it overshadowed empathy. This pattern was not only about individual failings, it was the result of an entire culture that cultivated myth-making as a survival strategy. John Wayne's authoritarian presence, Roman Polanski's protected genius, and Mickey Rooney's troubled ego all emerged from the same environment. Each star was shaped not only by personal flaws, but by a system that amplified those flaws through adoration, profit, and silence. Hollywood did not accidentally create monsters. It built them, marketed them, and disguised them in narratives that millions celebrated. Howard believed that the root of this problem lay in the unquestioned hierarchy that ruled the industry. Studio executives stood at the top, actors and filmmakers occupied the middle, and everyone else existed at the bottom, unseen but essential. When power flowed only downward, abuse flowed upward without resistance. The entire structure depended on people being afraid to speak, afraid to disrupt the myth, and afraid to challenge the narrative that sold millions of tickets. As he once reflected, the golden age was not corrupted by a few individuals. It was built on a foundation that made corruption inevitable. Beneath the costumes, scripts, and glamour, the industry encouraged perfection on the screen and silence behind it. The consequences were tragically predictable. What do you think about this? Comment Amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. The storm that followed these scandals was not driven solely by the actions of the stars, but by the powerful machinery that transformed private crises into public events. In the era before social media, before instant news alerts and digital transparency, Hollywood controlled information with remarkable precision. Yet, even in a world shaped by studio-crafted narratives, there were limits to how much the system could contain. When the truth began to seep into the public domain, the media avalanche became impossible to stop. For Ron Howard, who grew up in an era where the press had significantly less control from the studios, understanding the sheer force of that earlier media landscape was essential to understanding why these legends remained so deeply divided in public memory. The first major rupture in the carefully curated image of Hollywood came with Errol Flynn's 1942 trial. Newspapers framed the story with dramatic headlines, using words like debauchery and betrayal while simultaneously publishing glamorous photographs of Flynn arriving at the courthouse with a confident grin. The coverage was a contradiction, both condemning and celebrating him. Fans gathered outside the courtroom, cheering his name as if he were starring in another swashbuckling adventure. Critics, however, saw the trial as evidence of a moral collapse within the industry. The press became the battleground where two competing versions of the same man fought for dominance. Some articles portrayed him as a victim of false accusations against a beloved star, while others treated him as a dangerous figure whose fame had shielded him for too long. This division between adoration and outrage became a hallmark of Hollywood scandals. The public did not simply consume the news. They polarized around it. Studio executives, recognizing the volatility of public opinion, worked tirelessly to shape the narrative. Publicists leaked stories designed to protect their stars, while lawyers quietly negotiated deals behind closed doors. Witnesses associated with Flynn's case vanished, and certain newspapers reduced the severity of the allegations after receiving pressure from Warner Brothers. Flynn's behavior worsened, but the media's fascination with him grew stronger. As Howard later asserted, the trial revealed not only the darkness of the man, but the fragility of an industry desperately trying to preserve its myths. Kirk Douglas faced a different type of media storm. His conflicts on set, his outbursts of anger, and the whispered accounts of his private life were not always publicized during his peak years. The media at the time focused primarily on his charisma, his dramatic intensity, and his image as a Hollywood hero. Yet for insiders, the intensity came with a price. Crew members spoke quietly about scenes where Douglas exploded over minor inconveniences. Directors described moments where his presence dominated the entire production, shaping not only the film but the emotional climate of the set. When allegations connecting him to Natalie Wood resurfaced decades later, long after the golden age had faded, the media narrative changed significantly. Newspapers approached the story with a mixture of reverence and discomfort. Many journalists struggled to reconcile the powerful public image of Douglas with the gravity of the accusations. Some articles emphasized the lack of legal action, while others examined the culture of silence that had defined the era. For Ron Howard, this media tension highlighted an uncomfortable truth. The world had changed, but the shadow of the old Hollywood still lingered, influencing how stories were told and remembered. Fay Dunaway's media crisis was more prolonged and multifaceted. At the height of her fame, the press celebrated her brilliance, calling her performances electric, hypnotic, and unmatched. But behind the glamorous features and glowing reviews, quiet reports of turmoil on set began to circulate. Crew members who had worked with her described incidents of explosive anger, emotional manipulation, and scenes halted because she was dissatisfied with lighting or costume details. These accounts did not dominate newspaper headlines at first, but they spread persistently through industry publications, interviews, and whispered conversations at industry events. As Dunaway's reputation for volatility grew, more stories surfaced. Actors recounted being humiliated during emotional scenes. Makeup artists told of being shouted at for minor imperfections. Assistants spoke of being dismissed with a single glare. The media's fascination with her brilliance slowly merged with an acknowledgement of her darker tendencies. When she was dismissed from a Broadway revival in 2011, the news coverage reflected a shift. For the first time, the public saw the collapse of a figure once considered untouchable. According to Howard, Dunaway's story demonstrated how the media could both elevate and dismantle an icon, depending on the narrative that audiences wanted to believe. The case of John Wayne brought an entirely different dimension to the media avalanche. His public persona as the embodiment of the American spirit meant that both supporters and critics were deeply invested in preserving or challenging his legacy. During his lifetime, the press often portrayed him as a patriot, a symbol of traditional values, and a commanding presence in Hollywood. His political statements, however, especially those grounded in strong ideological positions, created deep divisions in public opinion. Many journalists praised him for his boldness, while others questioned the rigidity of his worldview. When his 1971 interview resurfaced decades later, the media landscape had shifted dramatically. Statements that once passed with little scrutiny now ignited intense debate. Articles revisited his comments about race, gender, and national identity, prompting a widespread reassessment of his legacy. Howard observed that this moment illustrated a rare reversal in Hollywood's long history, the past finally catching up to the present. The media no longer shielded Wayne but dissected him with the meticulousness once reserved only for his most iconic performances. Roman Polanski's media presence was perhaps the most polarizing. His artistic genius made him a favorite of critics and award committees, but the case involving Samantha Geimer marked a permanent fracture. The press followed every stage of his 1977 case with extraordinary intensity. Headlines captured the public's shock and confusion, framing him as both a celebrated filmmaker and an accused criminal. When Polanski fled the United States before sentencing, the media narrative became a global phenomenon. European publications questioned the fairness of the American legal system, while American outlets focused on the gravity of the crime. Howard believed that this split revealed the dangerous willingness of some to elevate art above accountability. Even decades later, as Polanski continued directing abroad, the media struggle persisted. His Oscar win for The Pianist in 2003 created one of the most surreal moments in Hollywood history. The camera panned across an audience offering a standing ovation, yet Howard refused to stand. He later said that the applause was a painful reminder of the child at the center of the story, a truth that no award could erase. Mickey Rooney's media collapse came slowly, quietly, and tragically. His early fame had made him a national treasure, but his later years were marked by financial troubles, addiction, and allegations of emotional and physical abuse. The public, accustomed to his cheerful roles, struggled to reconcile the joyful boy on screen with the troubled man he became. In interviews, he blamed studios, family members, and fate for his struggles, and the media documented his decline with a mixture of sympathy and dismay. Ron Howard once reflected that the media avalanche surrounding these figures did not simply expose their actions, it revealed the cost of Hollywood's myth-making culture. Fame could elevate, distort, or destroy a legacy depending on how much truth the world was finally willing to face. The stories of these 6 legends did not unfold as isolated tragedies. They moved toward inevitable breaking points, each shaped by years of silence, power, and unchecked behavior. For Ron Howard, the darkest moments of their lives revealed the true nature of Hollywood's golden age. It was not the glamour that defined them, but the fall. Each figure reached a point where the image they had built could no longer contain the truth, where the myth cracked under the weight of what had long been concealed. These moments, viewed through Howard's reflective lens, formed the climax of a deeper moral narrative about the industry he inherited. Errol Flynn's darkest hour came not at the height of his fame, but at the moment when fame failed to protect him. Although he was acquitted in the 1942 trial, the proceedings revealed far more than the verdict suggested. As he sat in the courtroom, grinning through testimony and treating accusations with mockery, the world saw a man who believed that charm was a shield against consequences. But when the trial ended, Howard believed that something inside Flynn had already broken. The acquittal did not restore his reputation, it distorted it. He became a symbol of the dangerous idea that celebrity could rewrite reality. His final years were defined by addiction, desperation, and decline. When he died in Vancouver in 1959, his autopsy listed heart failure, cirrhosis, and stomach ulcers, but Howard often said that these medical terms only disguised the truth. Flynn collapsed under the weight of a life spent taking from others and giving nothing in return. Kirk Douglas' darkest moment did not unfold in a courtroom, but in the quiet resurgence of a buried story. During his peak, Douglas had the power to silence accusations, intimidate colleagues, and command every set he walked onto. But decades later, when his name resurfaced in allegations concerning Natalie Wood, the past he had outrun finally caught up with him. Ron Howard regarded this moment as the turning point in Douglas' legacy. It was no longer about the heroic characters he played or the cinematic milestones he helped create. It became about the silence of the era that protected him. Even after his death at the age of 103, the questions surrounding his past did not fade. Howard believed that Douglas' story demonstrated the tragic cost of a career built on dominance rather than understanding. It showed that power without accountability cannot age into wisdom, it curdles into myth and regret. Fay Dunaway's darkest hour unfolded gradually, not through a single event, but through a series of unraveling moments that revealed how completely her pursuit of control had overtaken her compassion. On the set of her most challenging roles, she wielded authority with such intensity that it destabilized entire productions. Howard saw her as the embodiment of Hollywood's emotional extremism, where the desire for artistic perfection became entangled with the need to command every room. Her decline was slow but inevitable, as more directors refused to work with her and more productions cited her behavior as unmanageable. The industry that once adored her brilliance began to distance itself. The woman who once commanded the screen with hypnotic presence found herself increasingly isolated. Howard believed that Dunaway's story was a lesson about the cost of mistaking power for respect. Authority gained through fear does not endure. It collapses when the room finally stops listening. John Wayne's darkest moment emerged long after his films had cemented him as a cultural symbol. The resurfacing of his 1971 interview brought a wave of scrutiny that revealed a deep fracture between the man and the myth. His comments about race, gender, and national identity were not interpreted as reflections of a distant past, but as a reminder of how much influence he had wielded during his lifetime. Howard found this moment deeply symbolic, representing the point at which Hollywood could no longer disguise the prejudices that had once shaped its stories. Wayne had built a legacy rooted in masculinity and patriotism, but the interview exposed a worldview resistant to change and compassion. It was not simply the words themselves that defined his darkest hour, but the realization that his legend had been built on a foundation that refused to evolve. Roman Polanski's darkest hour arrived in 1977, not because of a loss of fame, but because of a confrontation with truth. The case involving Samantha Geimer became impossible to deny or reinterpret. Polanski, who had survived war, loss, and unimaginable trauma, committed an act that shattered any notion of moral complexity. Howard believed that the true climax of Polanski's story was not the crime itself, but his decision to flee the United States before sentencing. That act cemented his exile and transformed him into a symbol of Hollywood's willingness to protect brilliance at any cost. Every award he received afterward, every standing ovation, every critical praise became part of a painful contradiction. For Howard, the applause never drowned out the voice of the child whose life had been altered forever. Mickey Rooney's darkest hour came not from a single scandal, but from the accumulation of a lifetime of missteps, regrets, and destructive behavior. Once the highest-paid actor in America, he ended his life with an estate worth less than $20,000, his body initially unclaimed. The man who made the world laugh for decades faced the final chapter of his life in isolation and financial ruin. Howard considered Rooney's story to be the most tragic of all, not because his actions were uniquely monstrous, but because he had spent his life performing joy while living in misery. His pain became entertainment. His destruction became invisible. The smiling boy America adored eventually crumbled under the weight of a life defined by contradictions. As Ron Howard reflected on these 6 lives, he recognized a single pattern that connected all of them. Their darkest hours did not emerge from fate or misfortune. They were the culmination of a system that rewarded silence, celebrated myth-making, and allowed power to operate without accountability. The real climax was not in their individual falls, but in the collective realization that Hollywood's golden age had been built on unstable ground. The breakthrough came when Howard understood that the industry he loved could only move forward by confronting its past honestly. The stories of these legends were not warnings meant to inspire fear, but lessons meant to inspire awareness. Hollywood could only evolve if it acknowledged that brilliance does not excuse cruelty, and that fame does not erase responsibility. In this understanding, Howard found clarity, not condemnation. The path toward a more ethical future began with the willingness to look directly at the shadows cast by the brightest lights. The aftermath of these stories stretches far beyond the lives of the people who lived them. When Ron Howard reflected on the lessons hidden within Hollywood's golden age, he understood that the real significance of these narratives was not found in individual scandals, but in the collective portrait they created. Each rise and fall revealed the fragility of an industry built on illusion, performance, and the relentless pursuit of spotlight. These six figures were not anomalies. They were the consequences of a system designed to elevate talent while obscuring truth. Their legacies, complex and often painful, forced the industry to examine the cost of myths created without accountability. As time passed, Howard recognized that the greatest tragedy was not the existence of wrongdoing, but the silence that surrounded it. A world that celebrated fame so intensely had allowed its admiration to overshadow compassion and responsibility. The Golden Age, once remembered for elegance and artistic mastery, became a reminder of how power can distort reality when no one questions it. In each of these stories, the pattern was unmistakable, brilliance was praised, cruelty was dismissed, and consequences were absorbed by those with less power, less influence, and fewer opportunities to speak. Instead, the shadows cast by these legends stretched across decades, shaping how Hollywood remembered its own past. Yet there was a second truth that emerged from Howard's reflection. While the industry had changed, its vulnerability to the same patterns remained. Modern Hollywood faced new forms of pressure, new expectations, and new consequences shaped by digital transparency and global audiences. But the fundamental question persisted. Would the industry continue to reward myth-making in silence, or would it learn from the past it once tried to erase? Howard believed that true progress required more than public statements or symbolic gestures. It required an honest reckoning with the forces that shaped its earliest icons. Without that reckoning, the future risked repeating the failures of the past. The stories of Flynn, Douglas, Dunaway, Wayne, Polanski, and Rooney offer a somber blueprint for understanding how acclaim can evolve into entitlement, how admiration can obscure cruelty, and how talent can become a shield rather than a responsibility. Their achievements remain a part of cinematic history, but so do their flaws. Howard did not seek to erase their contributions. He sought to understand the impact of their choices and the environment that enabled them. In that understanding lies the central lesson of Hollywood's evolution. Greatness and goodness are not the same, and fame without humility becomes a destructive force. As Howard often said, the brilliance of cinema does not come from perfection, but from truth. Stories that endure are those that embrace complexity rather than hide from it. The golden age of Hollywood may not have been golden in the moral sense, but its legacy provides a powerful reminder of what the entertainment world must guard against. The past cannot be rewritten, but its lessons can illuminate the path forward. The question then falls to the audience, the fans, and the future storytellers. What will they choose to remember? The myths that kept the shadows hidden, or the truths that reveal the industry's deeper humanity? Howard believed that every generation must make that choice with clarity and courage. Which of these six actors shocked you the most? The predator, the tyrant, or the smiling liar? Let me know in the comments.